Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be speaking with some very, very interesting guests who have a lot of experience in digital embellishment. And the theme of today's show is going to be overcoming production issues with digital embellishment. And a lot of these questions that we're going to be going through today have actually been submitted by users themselves. We're kind of curious as to how some other people around the world, around the country, are handling some of these typical obstacles. So first, let me introduce our guests, Ken Huizenga. Ken, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're here and kind of what qualifies you to answer some of these questions that we have today?
Sure, Kevin, I'd be happy to. My name is Ken Huizenga. I've been in the printing industry for about 3 decades. And I spent about the last 6 to 7 years in the world of embellishment. It's always been a love of mine. I think it takes printing to the next level. And anything that has anything to do with embellishment, I'm your guy. I love it. I can't wait to talk about it.
Beautiful, beautiful. Welcome back, Ken. And then we also have Matt Redbear. Matt, if you don't follow him on LinkedIn, also you should check out what he does on LinkedIn. Really, really interesting videos. Matt, tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of what qualifies you to answer some of these questions that we have for us today.
Well, I've been in the digital embellishment industry for a little over 3 years now. Prior to that, I was in pre-press for almost 12 years and saw every kind of file that there was to see and every kind of layering, structure, whatever to deal with. That was my day in and day out. I've done everything in between photography, creative direction, and running a printing press for a little while, whether ink on my hands or running a digital machine.
Very nice. So you have both the design aspect, but also the production aspect when you're actually running the press. So
Exactly.
That's excellent. So we have two really excellent profiles of people who have not just long experience in the industry, but have had a lot of recent experience on equipment themselves. So, gentlemen, the first question that we're going to cover today, when it comes to digital embellishment specifically, is really regarding paper stocks. And kind of wanted to go around and ask you guys, what kind of limitations are you seeing when it comes to the type of paper stocks that you can and can't use? And which ones do you really recommend for the best possible final result? So, Matt, why don't we start with you?
Well, I kind of divide it up into 3 different categories. There's the ones that absolutely do work. There's the ones that absolutely do not work. And then there were the ones that can be made to work, and they have special situations, special production requirements to be able to use them. Obviously, what's going to work best is going to be a smooth coated stock. It's going to give you smooth, even results. If you want a mirror finish, and I want to clarify too that what we're talking about mostly here is polymer, varnish, overlays. We can move on to other digital embellishment methods, but when it comes to laying down inkjet varnish, the smoother the stock, the smoother your results. There are others that will surprise you. I've used offset stocks. I've used things like Blazer Digital Satin. I've used Royal Sundance Felt, which you would think would never work with the polymer overlay. Cougar Digital. Their choice cover will work if you're using small areas. If you're using larger areas, you're going to run into problems. I've actually used offset parchment, which isn't supposed to work, and offset laid can be made to work. There are methods you can, but there are others that just simply cannot work. Anything that has a heavily embossed or hatched surface like these linens. They do make a digital linen, but it will pick up the texture if you're laying foil on top of that. They make these glittery type of papers that almost have a gritty or sandpaper-like surface. If you run your fingertips over it, will not work. There's nothing you can do to make that paper work. And then there are the super porous felt types of paper or a cork surface that simply will not work.
Very good. Matt, a real quick question before we get to Ken. I know that you recently put out a video talking about uncoated, and I'm sure we're probably going to address this question. Uncoated has traditionally been the Achilles heel or the holy grail of being able to do digital. And you've recently put out some tips and tricks on how to go into uncoated. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the process, is when you're putting inkjet onto the paper, onto an uncoated sheet, it's very much like putting water on a sponge, where the varnish just gets absorbed into the paper and then kind of disappears, and you lose the effect, and that varnish is just sitting inside. Do you want to kind of cover some of the really, really quickly how you've kind of been able to overcome some uncoated papers? I'm guessing not all.
Uncoated and or offset. If you just, the sales reps in my workplace refer to them as offset stock, and then they're just basically referring to any uncoated stock. You have to create a barrier somehow, whether it's through laying down your toner first. You have an advantage when you're using an iGen. You have the fuser oil, which creates an additional barrier on top of the toner. You can use a clear toner as an underlay. You can use a white toner as an underlay. You can use any color of toner, preferably that it hits more than 60% of the maximum. And then, the darker, the better the coverage you'll have. But you need some type of barrier. So you could pre-coat the sheet as well, or laminate.
Ken, how about you? I mean, you've had a lot of experiences with different paper stocks, depending on different applications. What have you kind of seen regarding some of the limitations you saw when you were working with your digital embellishment press?
Well, much like Matt said, the smoother the surface, the better. I had far more luck with that. I think a couple of things that come into play here is the design. If you're going to have a stock that maybe isn't the smoothest sheet, then maybe some of the fine detail is not what you want to do. But if you want to flood coat with your embellishment press, go ahead and do that. I tended to prefer, and so did the customers, a dull coated sheet because the glossy varnish had more contrast from one to the other. And, if you're going to introduce foil, then that's fine because you can put that even on a piece of chrome coat, and the shiny foil and the shiny substrate help bring an image to life. A couple other things that are really important is to make sure that you keep your substrate as flat as possible. I always found when ordering parent size sheets and cutting them down that reintroduced a moisture change. It could often curl a stock. Obviously, with the sheets going under heads that it clears by 0.5 mil, you want to be sure you keep it as flat as possible. So sometimes ordering pre-cut stock that's already been conditioned, has been sitting on your shelf a while, will lend itself to a much better embellished product. A lot of the pearl ices and the metallic look papers do work. You have to take into account both design elements and what the end use is for the product, because there's a lot of concerns there, whether or not it'll crack, whether or not it can stand up to the bindery concerns that you have, as well as just making sure that it'll stand up to abuse it could potentially get, depending on where it's going, where the customer's going to send it.
Yeah, those are some excellent points, Ken. I think that's one of the things that we definitely try to stress as much as trying to condition the paper to your local production environment, so you didn't have to deal with those issues regarding the warping of the paper, especially when going under the head. So that's a great point.
A couple of more things that come to mind too is your dine level is very important. You're putting down a liquid and it has to distribute itself just right. So there are dine pens so you can test substrates so you don't get yourself into a bind before you start. So if a customer were to ask you to use a certain type of stock that you've never used before, I strongly recommend having those dine pens in stock because you want to make sure that that's in the perfect printing range.
Yeah, I agree. Because that dine is going to help two things, right, Ken? It's going to help with bite, so how much adhesion you're going to get into the paper, but also wettability, so how well does that varnish smooth out to get really nice glossy look. And those are the two things that you really want. You want it to adhere and you want it to flow on that sheet as nicely as possible. So what about this? I mean, I remember running into issues for clients also from time to time on certain C2S's sheets. So basically the coatings on both sides of the sheet. And if you built up a big enough stack, some of that issue was the coating would stick to that varnish if it was too hot in the production environment. Did you guys ever run into that or anything like that, or not so much?
Well, yeah, and just things that can stick together in general if you're printing on both sides. It's all stock dependent, but the smoother and glossier your stock, the more of a problem you're going to have. We have built a rack. It's a bunch of dowels that stand up They're tall and they're spaced so far apart that we literally stand, when it comes off the stacker, we stand them up rather than lay them down to get the pressure off of them, and then they stand up and cure for another 24 to 48 hours, and that usually overcomes that problem.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you very much, and we will see you very soon.